Okay, today we're going to be reading And Then There Were None, Chapter 3, keeping in mind that the version that I have might be slightly different from the version that you have. But we are starting on Chapter 3. We left off with the characters coming down to dinner, keeping in mind that they didn't really know each other. They were a little confused. Who is this host? Who are these people? Why are we here? And now we're joining them at the dinner table. Dinner was drawing to a close. The food had been good, the wine perfect. Mr. Rogers waited, served them well. Everyone was in better spirits. They began to talk to each other with more freedom and intimacy. Mr. Justice Wargrave, mellowed by the excellent port, that means wine, was being amusing in a caustic fashion. Dr. Armstrong and Tony Marston were listening to him. Miss Brent chatted to General MacArthur. They had discovered some mutual friends. Vera Claythorne was asking Mr. Davis intelligent questions about South Africa. Mr. Davis was quite fluent on the subject. Lombard listened to the conversation. Once or twice he looked up quickly, and his eyes narrowed. Now and then his eyes played round the table, studying the others. Anthony Marston said suddenly, "Quaint, these things, aren't they?" In the center of the round table, on a circular glass stand, were some little china figures. "Indians," said Tony. "Indian Island. I suppose that's the idea. So you could picture little ceramic figurines that people might have in their house for decoration or something like that. When they say china figures, it has nothing to do with the country China, because that would be a capital C. It has to do with, maybe at Thanksgiving or at Christmas time or Hanukkah for a special occasion, at your grandmother's house maybe. She pulls out her special china to serve dinner on. That's what they're talking about, that special porcelain material that we call china. That is what the figurines are made of, very breakable glass. Vera leaned forward. "I wonder, how many are there? 10? "Yes, 10 there are," Vera cried. "What fun! They're the 10 little Indian boys of the nursery rhyme, I suppose. In my bedroom, the rhyme is framed and hung up over the mantelpiece," Lombard said. "In my room, too. And mine. And mine." Everybody joined the chorus. Vera said, "It's an amusing idea, isn't it?" Mr. Justice Wargrave grunted, "Remarkably childish," and helped himself to port. Remember, that means wine. Emily Brent looked at Vera Claythorne. Vera Claythorne looked at Miss Brent. The two women rose. In the drawing room, the French windows were open onto the terrace, that means patio, and the sound of the sea murmuring against the rocks came up to them. Emily Brent said, "Pleasant sound? I hate it." Remember, Vera was involved in some kind of a coroner's inquest, and she talked about drowning, so you can imagine that the sound of the sea is upsetting to Vera. Miss Brent's eyes looked at her in surprise. Vera flushed. She said more composedly, "I don't think this place would be very agreeable in a storm." Emily Brent agreed. "I've no doubt the house is shut up in winter," she said. "You've never got servants to stay here, for one thing." Vera murmured, "It must be difficult to get servants anyway." Emily Brent said, "Mrs. Oliver has been lucky to get these two. The woman's a good cook," meaning Mrs. Rogers. Vera thought, funny how elderly people get names wrong, because Vera, remember, thinks that the host is Mrs. Owen, and now Emily Brent has said Miss Oliver. She said, "Yes, I think Miss Owen has been very lucky indeed." Emily Brent had brought a small piece of embroidery out of her bag. Now, as she was about to thread her needle, she paused. She said sharply, "Owen, did you say Owen?" "Yes," Emily Brent said sharply. "I've never met anyone called Owen in my life." Vera stared, but surely. She didn't finish her sentence. The door opened and the men joined them. Rogers followed them into the room with the coffee tray. The judge came and sat down by Emily Brent. Armstrong came up to Vera. Tony Marston, the young guy with the fancy car, strolled to the open window. Blore studied him with naive surprise, a statuette in brass, wondering perhaps if its bizarre angularities were really supposed to be the female figure. General MacArthur stood with his back to the mantelpiece. He pulled at his little white mustache. That had been a darn good dinner. His spirits were rising. Lombard turned over the pages of Punch magazine that lay with the other papers on the table by the wall. Rogers went round with the coffee tray. The coffee was good, really black and very hot. The whole party had dined well. They were satisfied with themselves and with life. The hands of the clock pointed to 20 minutes past 9. There was a silence, a comfortable, replete silence. Into that silence came the voice. Without warning, inhumane, penetrating. "Ladies and gentlemen, silence, please." Everyone was startled. They looked around at each other, at the walls. Who was speaking? So in class sometimes when somebody uses the intercom to speak to you, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, where's that voice coming from? What's happening? That's what the guests are experiencing. They had no idea that there even was an intercom. They're at somebody's house. So they're very surprised to hear this voice. The voice went on, a high, clear voice. "You are charged with the following indictments. Edward George Armstrong." Remember, that's Dr. Armstrong. "That you did upon the 14th day of March, 1925, cause the death of Louisa Mary Cleese. Emily Caroline Brent. That upon the 5th of November, 1931, you were responsible for the death of Beatrice Taylor. William Henry Bloor," the one who's been lying about his name. "That you brought about the death of James Stephen Landor on October 10th, 1928. Vera Elizabeth Claythorne. That on the 11th day of August, 1935, you killed Cyril Ogilvy Hamilton. Philip Lombard. That upon a date in February 1932, you were guilty of the death of 21 men, members of an East African tribe. John Gordon MacArthur. That on the 4th of January, 1917, you deliberately sent your wife's lover, Arthur Richmond, to his death. Anthony James Marston," the young guy with the fancy car. "That upon the 14th day of November last, you were guilty of the murder of John and Lucy Combs. Thomas Rogers and Ethel Rogers. That on the 6th of May, 1929, you brought about the death of Jennifer Brady. Lawrence John Wargrave," that would be the judge. "That upon the 10th day of June, 1930, you were guilty of the murder of Edward Seaton. Prisoners at the bar, have you anything to say in your defense?" So if you stop and really think about what that would be like. You're a character in the story. So imagine yourself. You have gone out to this island. You think you're going to see this amazing house, a mansion possibly, that may have been owned by a famous movie star. So you think maybe you're going out to Brad Pitt's house. And you get there and you're a little confused. You go to dinner. Dinner was nice. And you're just starting to relax. And then all of a sudden, a voice out of nowhere comes and accuses you of a murder. Not only would that be upsetting to you, but when you look around at the people that you're sitting with, it would be like, what about these people? What is going on here? The voice had stopped. There was a moment's petrified silence and then a resounding crash. Mr. Rogers had dropped the coffee tray because just like you, he's shocked, like, oh my goodness, what is going on with this voice? At the same moment, from somewhere outside the room, there came a scream and the sound of a thud. Lombard was the first to move. He leapt to the floor and flung it open. Outside, lying in a huddled mass, was Mrs. Rogers. Lombard called, "Marston!" Anthony sprang to help him. Between them, they lifted up the woman and carried her into the drawing room. Dr. Armstrong came across quickly. He helped them to lift her onto the sofa and bent over her. He said quickly, "It's nothing. She's fainted, that's all. She'll be around in a minute." So good thing they have the doctor there. Lombard said to Rogers, "Get some brandy." Rogers, his face white, his hands shaking, murmured, "Yes, sir," and slipped quickly out of the room. Vera cried out, "Who was that speaking? Where was he? It sounded... General MacArthur spluttered out, "What's going on here? What kind of practical joke was that?" His hand was shaking. His shoulders sagged. He looked suddenly 10 years older. Bloor was mopping his face with a handkerchief. Remember, he's the one that keeps telling everyone his last name is Davis. Only Mr. Justice Wargrave and Miss Brent seemed comparatively unmoved. Emily Brent sat upright, her head held high. In both cheeks was a spot of hard color. The judge sat in his habitual pose, his head sunk down into his neck. With one hand, he gently scratched his ear. Only his eyes were active, darting round and round the room, puzzled, alert with intelligence. Again, it was Lombard who acted, Armstrong being busy with the collapsed woman. Lombard was free once more to take the initiative. He said, "That voice, it sounded as though it were in the room." Vera cried, "Who was it? Who was it? It wasn't one of us." Like the judge, Lombard's eyes wandered slowly round the room. They rested a minute on the open window. Then he shook his head decisively. Suddenly, his eyes lighted up. He moved forward swiftly to where a door near the fireplace led into an adjoining room. With a swift gesture, he caught the handle and flung the door open. He passed through and immediately uttered an exclamation of satisfaction. He said, "Ah, here we are." The others crowded after him. Only Miss Brent remained alone, sitting erect in the chair. Inside the second room, a table had been brought up close to the wall, which adjoined the drawing room. On the table was a gramophone, an old-fashioned type with a large trumpet attached. So if you want to pause it and look up to see what a gramophone is, you can do that now. But it's an old-fashioned record player, the kind that has that big trumpet attached that you can move around to position where you want the sound. So if you can imagine, the wall behind me goes to a hallway. But in this case, it would go to a room. So somebody had a gramophone with that big trumpet pressed against this wall on the other side of it, and they had drilled very small holes into this wall so that the sound would travel from that room into this room. The mouth of the trumpet was against the wall, and Lombard, pushing it aside, indicated where 2 or 3 small holes had been unobtrusively, like hardly noticeable, bored or drilled through the wall. Adjusting the gramophone, he replaced the needle on the record, and immediately they heard again, "You are charged with the following indictments." Vera cried, "Turn it off! Turn it off! It's horrible!" Lombard obeyed. Dr. Armstrong said, with a sigh of relief, "A disgraceful and heartless practical joke, I suppose." The small, clear voice of Mr. Justice Wargrave murmured, "So you think it's a joke, do you?" The doctor stared at him. What else could it be? The hand of the judge gently stroked his upper lip. He said, "At the moment, I'm not prepared to give an opinion." Anthony Marston broke in. He said, "Look here, there's one thing you've forgotten. Who the devil turned the thing on and set it going?" Wargrave murmured, "Yes, I think we must inquire into that." He led the way back into the drawing room. The others followed. Rogers had come in with a glass of brandy. Miss Brent was bending over the moaning form of Mrs. Rogers. Adroitly, Rogers slipped between the 2 women. "Allow me, madam. I'll speak to her. Ethel? Ethel, it's all right. All right, do you hear? Pull yourself together." Mrs. Rogers' breath came in quick gasps. Her eyes, staring, frightened eyes, went round and round the ring of faces. There was urgency in Rogers' tone. "Pull yourself together, Ethel." Dr. Armstrong spoke to her soothingly. "You'll be all right now, Mrs. Rogers. Just a nasty turn." She said, "Did I faint, sir?" "Yes." "It was the voice, that awful voice, like a judgment." Her face turned green again, her eyelids fluttered. Dr. Armstrong said sharply, "Where's that brandy?" Rogers had put it down on a little table. Someone handed it to the doctor, and he bent over the gasping woman with it. "Drink this, Mrs. Rogers." She drank, choking a little and gasping. The spirit did her good. The color returned to her face. She said, "I'm all right now. It just gave me a turn." Rogers said quickly, "Of course it did. Gave me a turn, too. Fair made me drop that tray. Wicked lies it was, I'd like to know." He was interrupted. It was only a cough, a little dry cough, but it had the effect of stopping him in full cry. He stared at Mr. Justice Wargrave, and the latter coughed again. Then he said, "Who put that record on the gramophone? Was it you, Rogers?" Rogers cried, "I didn't know what it was. Before God, I didn't know what it was, sir. If I had, I'd never have done it." The judge said dryly, "That is probably true, but I think you better explain, Rogers." The butler wiped his face with a handkerchief. He said earnestly, "I was just obeying orders, sir, that's all." "Whose orders?" "Mr. Owen's." Mr. Justice Wargrave said, "Let me get this quite clear. Mr. Owen's orders were what, exactly?" Rogers said, "I was to put on a record on the gramophone. I'd find the record in the drawer, and my wife was to start the gramophone when I'd gone into the drawing room with the coffee tray." The judge murmured, "A very remarkable story." Rogers cried, "It's the truth, sir. I swear to God it's the truth. I didn't know what it was. Not for a moment. It had a name on it. I thought it was just a piece of music." Wargrave looked at Lombard. "Is there a title on it?" Lombard nodded. He grinned suddenly, showing his white pointed teeth. He said, "Quite right, sir. It was entitled Swan Song." So a swan song indicates somebody's last performance. And usually it's at a ballet, but that term has become known as your last performance before you're never going to do whatever it is that you did again. General MacArthur broke out suddenly. He exclaimed, "The whole thing is preposterous! Preposterous! Singing accusations about like this! Something must be done about it. This fellow Owen, whoever he is," Emily Brent interrupted. She said sharply, "That's just it. Who is he?" The judge interposed. He spoke with the authority that a lifetime in the courts had given him. He said, "That is exactly what we must go into very carefully. I should suggest that you get your wife to bed first of all, Rogers, then come back here." "Yes, sir," Dr. Armstrong said. "I'll give you a hand, Rogers." Leaning on the two men, Mrs. Rogers tottered out of the room. When they had gone, Tony Marston, the young guy with the sports car, said, "Don't know about you, sir, but I could do with a drink." Lombard said, "I agree." Tony said, "I'll go and forage." He went out of the room. He returned a second or two later. "Found them all waiting on a tray outside, ready to be brought in." He set down his burden carefully. So he's coming in with a big tray of drinks for everybody. The next minute or two was spent in dispensing drinks. General MacArthur had a stiff whiskey, and so did the judge. Everyone felt the need of a stimulant. Only Emily Brent demanded and obtained a glass of water. Dr. Armstrong re-entered the room. "She's all right," he said. "I've given her a sedative to take, something to make her sleep." "What's that, a drink?" "I could do with one." Several of the men refilled their glasses. A moment or two later, Rogers re-entered the room. Mr. Justice Wargrave took charge of the proceedings. That's an important piece because he's used to taking charge. He's a judge. He's used to asking people questions. He's used to getting to the bottom of things. And so it's natural that the judge would be the person who's taking charge now. The room became an impromptu court of law. The judge said, "Now then, Rogers, we must get to the bottom of this. Who is this Mr. Owen?" Rogers stared. "He owns the place, sir." "I'm aware of that fact. What I want you to tell me is what you yourself know about the man." Rogers shook his head. "I can't say, sir. You see, I've never met him." There was a faint stir in the room. General MacArthur said, "You've never seen him? What do you mean?" "We've only been here just under a week, sir, my wife and I. We were engaged, meaning hired, by letter through an agency, the Regina Agency in Plymouth." Laura nodded. "Old established firm," he volunteered. Wargrave said, "Have you got that letter?" "The letter? Engaging us? No, sir, I didn't keep it." "Go on with your story." "You were hired, as you say, by letter." "Yes, sir." "We were to arrive on a certain day." "We did. Everything was in order here. Plenty of food in stock, and everything very nice. Just needed dusting and that." "What next?" "Nothing, sir. We got orders by letter again to prepare the room for a house party. And then yesterday, by the afternoon post, like the post office, I got another letter from Mr. Owen. It said he and Mrs. Owen were detained, and to do the best we could and gave the instructions about dinner and coffee and putting on the gramophone record." The judge said sharply, Surely you've got that letter." "Yes, sir, I've got it here." He produced it from a pocket. The judge took it. He said, "Headed," meaning the heading on the letter. So at the very top of a letter, when a business sends it to you, like if you get a letter from the school district, it would have the name of the school district at the top of the letter. Headed, Ritz Hotel, and typewritten. With a quick movement, Flora was beside him. He said, "If you'll just let me have a look." He twitched it out of the other's hands, and and ran his eye over it. He murmured, "Coronation machine. Quite new, no defects, and signed paper, the most widely used make. You won't get anything out of that. Might be fingerprints, but I doubt it." Wargrave stared at him with sudden attention. Anthony Marston was standing beside Bloor, looking over his shoulder. He said, "Got some fancy Christian names, hasn't he? Ulick Norman Owen, quite a mouthful." The old judge said with a slight start, "I'm obliged to you, Mr. Marston. You've drawn my attention to a curious and suggestive point." He looked around at the others, and thrusting his neck forward like an angry tortoise, he said, "I think the time has come for us all to pool our information. It would be well, I think, for everybody to come forward with all the information they have regarding the owner of this house." He paused and then went on, "We are all his guests. I think it would be profitable if each of us were to explain exactly how that came about." There was a moment's pause, and then Emily Brent spoke with decision. "There's something very peculiar about all this," she said. "I received a letter with a signature that was not very easy to read. It purported to be from a woman I had met at a certain summer resort 2 or 3 years ago. I took the name to be either Ogden or Oliver. I am acquainted with the Mrs. Oliver and also with the Miss Ogden. I am quite certain that I have never met or become friendly with anyone of the name of Owen." Mr. Justice Wargrave said, "You have that letter, Miss Brent?" "Yes, I will fetch it for you." She went away and returned a minute later with the letter. The judge read it. He said, "I begin to understand. Miss Claythorne." Vera explained the circumstances of her secretarial engagement, meaning that, remember, she was a PE teacher and was hired to be a secretary at the island as a holiday job. The judge said, "Marston." Anthony said, "I got a wire, like an email, from a pal of mine, Badger Berkeley. Surprised me at the time because I had an idea the old horse had gone to Norway, and he told me to roll up here." He's the young guy with the fancy car. Again, Wargrave nodded. He said, "Dr. Armstrong." "I was called in professionally." "I see. You had no previous acquaintance with the family?" "No. A colleague of mine was mentioned in the letter." The judge said, "To give," and then this next word is a big, long word, and all it means is credibility. It'd be like if I told you that one of your best friends told me something. I'm saying that because I want you to believe me. I want you to trust me because I know that you trust your best friend. "Yes, and that colleague, I presume, was momentarily out of touch with you?" "Well, yes." Lombard, who had been staring at Bloor, said suddenly, "Look here, I just thought of something." The judge lifted a hand. "In a minute. We will take one thing at a time, Mr. Lombard. We are at present inquiring into the causes which have resulted in our being assembled here tonight. General MacArthur." Pulling at his mustache, the general muttered, "I got a letter from this fellow Owen. Mentioned some old pals of mine who were to be here. Hoped I'd excuse informal invitation. Haven't kept the letter, I'm afraid." Wargrave said, "Mr. Lombard." Lombard's brain had been active. Was he to come out in the open or not? He made up his mind. "Same sort of thing," he said. "Invitation, mention mutual friends. I fell for it. All right, I've torn up the letter." Mr. Justice Wargrave turned his attention to Mr. Bloor, who lied and said he was Mr. Davis. His forefinger stroked his upper lip, and his voice was dangerously polite. He said, "Just now we had a somewhat disturbing experience. An apparently disembodied voice spoke to us all by name, uttering certain precise accusations against us. We will deal with those accusations presently. At the moment, I am interested in a minor point. Amongst the names recited was that of William Henry Bloor. But as far as we know, there is no one named Bloor amongst us. The name of Davis was not mentioned. What have you to say about that, Mr. Davis?" Bloor said sulkily, "Cat's out of the bag, it seems. I suppose I better admit my name isn't Davis." "You are William Henry Bloor?" "That's right. I will add something," said Lombard. "Not only are you here under a false name, Mr. Bloor, but in addition, I've noticed this evening that you're a first-class liar. You claim to have come from Natal, South Africa. I know South Africa and Natal and I'm prepared to swear that you've never set foot in South Africa in your life. All eyes were turned on Bloor. Angry, suspicious eyes. Anthony Marston moved a step nearer to him. His fists clenched themselves. All eyes were turned on Bloor. Angry, suspicious eyes. Anthony Marston moved a step nearer to him. His fists clenched themselves. "Now then, you swine," he said. "Any explanation?" Bloor flung back his head and set his square jaw. "You gentlemen have got me wrong," he said. "I've got my credentials and you can see them. I'm an ex-CID man, so think like CIA, FBI, something like that. I run a detective agency in Plymouth. I was put on this job." Mr. Justice Wargrave asked, "By whom?" "This man Owen enclosed a handsome money order for expenses and instructed me as to what he wanted done. I was to join the house party, posing as a guest. I was given all your names. I was to watch you all." "Any reason given?" Bloor said bitterly. "Mrs. Owen's jewels. Mrs. Owen, my foot. I don't believe there is any such person." Again, the forefinger of the judge stroked his lip, this time appreciatively. "Your conclusions are, I think, justified," he said. "Ulrich Norman Owen. In Miss Brent's letter, though the signature of the surname is a mere scrawl, the Christian names are reasonably clear. Una, Nancy. In either case, you notice the same initials. Ulrich Norman Owen. Una, Nancy, Owen. Each time that is to say U.N. Owen, or by a slight stretch of fancy. Unknown." Vera cried, "But this is fantastic! Mad!" The judge nodded gently. He said, "Oh, yes. I've no doubt in my own mind that we have been invited here by a madman, probably a dangerous, homicidal lunatic." And that's the end of chapter 3.